They snapped the handcuffs on her wrists in front of everyone, her coworkers, her patients, the people she had spent years protecting. They called it an arrest. But Hannah Mercer knew the truth. This wasn't justice. This was a warning, and the men behind it had no idea what they had just started. Because the moment those cuffs clicked shut, the clock started ticking not on Hannah's freedom, but on theirs. If this story moves you, hit that subscribe button right now and drop your city in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. The night Hannah Mercer was arrested, the temperature in Ridgewood Falls had dropped to 23 degrees, and her hands were shaking, not from the cold, but from everything she was carrying inside of her. She had parked in the same spot she always parked, third row from the south entrance, under the light that had been flickering for 7 months, and that hospital administration had still never fixed. She noticed things like that. She always had. That was the part of her the Army had never managed to train out, the obsessive, relentless habit of noticing what other people chose to ignore. She was reaching for her bag when she heard the footsteps behind her. Not one set, two. Moving fast and purposeful, the way men move when they've already made up their minds about what's going to happen next. She turned. 2 officers in Ridgewood Falls Police Department uniforms were crossing the parking lot toward her, and even in that first second, that fraction of a second before anything was said, before any badge was shown, before any word was spoken, Hannah's stomach dropped because she recognized one of them. Officer Dale Pruitt. She had treated his wife in the emergency room 14 months ago after a car accident on Route 9. She remembered his face, the way he'd squeezed his wife's hand in the hallway. She remembered thinking he seemed like a decent man. He wasn't looking at her like a decent man right now. Hannah Mercer. The other officer spoke first, younger someone she didn't recognize, his hand already resting on his belt, like he was hoping she'd give him a reason. Yes, she said slowly. That's me. You're under arrest. She blinked. I'm sorry, what? Turn around, ma'am, hands behind your back. Under arrest for what? What is this? Pruitt stepped backward, and to his credit, if you could call it that, he at least had the grace to look away from her eyes when he said it. Theft of controlled substances? Hospital property? You have the right to remain silent. That is a lie, Hannah said. Her voice didn't shake. She needed it not to shake. That is an absolute lie, and you know it. Pruitt still wouldn't look at her. The younger officer grabbed her arm, and Hannah, 13 years as a combat medic, 2 tours in Afghanistan, a woman who had kept herself calm while applying pressure to wounds that would have made most people pass out, Hannah let him turn her around. She let him put the handcuffs on, because she understood in that cold, crystalline moment that fighting back was exactly what they wanted. They wanted a scene. They wanted a reason. And she wasn't going to give it to them. But as the metal locked around her wrists, she was already thinking, already calculating, already somewhere behind her controlled breathing and her deliberately blank expression running through everything she had hidden, everything she had copied, every name she had documented, every date, every transaction, every photograph she had taken at 3 a.m. when no one was watching. They think they've stopped me, she thought. They have no idea they've just pulled the pin on the grenade. Hannah counted every one of them. Not because she was afraid, though fear was there, coiled somewhere underneath everything else, but because she needed to stay sharp. She needed to stay present. She needed to not fall apart in the back of a police cruiser while Officer Dale Pruitt drove in silence. And the younger one, his nameplate said Kovich, stared at his phone. She kept her breathing even. In for 4 counts, hold for 4, out for 4. The same rhythm she had used in the field when everything was falling apart and she was the only thing standing between a wounded soldier and whatever came next. Think, she told herself. Who knows you're here? Who's going to notice you're gone? The answer was not many people. That had been by design. For the past 8 months, Hannah had been careful, almost pathologically, careful about who she talked to, what she said, who she trusted. Because the thing about corruption at the level she had uncovered was that it didn't stay contained to the people at the top. It seeped down. It infected. It reached places you never expected. She had learned that the hard way. She had learned it the day she found Dr. Patricia Frost's signature on a document it never should have been on. But she pushed that thought away. Not now. She couldn't afford to go there right now. A woman in her 50s sat on one of the benches, staring at nothing. Hannah sat on the opposite side, placed her hands carefully on her knees, and focused on the wall. It was approximately 10 minutes before the mocking started. She heard them before she saw them. 2 officers leaning against the wall outside the cell, speaking just loud enough to make sure she could hear every word. Heard she thought she was some kind of hero, one of them said, like one of those whistleblower types. Whistleblower. The other one laughed. She's a drug thief, plain and simple. Shame, though, she seemed like a decent nurse, could have kept her head down, kept her chill, kept her life nice and quiet. Guess some people just don't know when to stop poking around in things that aren't their business. Hannah didn't move, didn't flinch. She had been talked about like she wasn't in the room by people far more intimidating than a couple of small-town police officers with a script they'd clearly rehearsed. What they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that approximately 4 hours earlier, before her shift had even ended, Hannah had made a phone call. Not to a lawyer, not to a friend, to a number that had been given to her 6 weeks ago, written in pencil on a scrap of paper by a man named Marcus Davenport, who had approached her in the parking lot of a grocery store 17 miles outside of Ridgewood Falls and told her very quietly and very calmly that the FBI knew what she had found and they needed her to be patient for just a little while longer. She had been patient. She had been patient for 6 more weeks. And then they'd arrested her, and patience was officially no longer an option. I made the call she thought sitting in that cold holding cell while the officers outside laughed at her expense. I made the call before they ever touched me. It's already done. Special Agent Marcus Davenport had been awake for 31 hours when his phone rang. He was in a converted conference room that his team had taken over in a federal building 40 miles from Ridgewood Falls, surrounded by boards covered in photographs, names, dollar amounts, shipping manifests, and the kind of layered, interlocking conspiracy that made even experienced federal agents take a step back and say, "How did this stay hidden this long?" He answered on the first ring. "She's been arrested," said the voice on the other end. Davenport set down his coffee cup slowly. When, 40 minutes ago, parking lot of Ridgewood Memorial, they charged her with theft of controlled substances. For a moment, the conference room was completely silent, except for the hum of the computers. Then Davenport said very quietly, "They just made this a lot easier for us." His second-in-command, Agent Reyes, looked up from across the room. "They arrested her. They arrested her." Davenport was already pulling on his jacket, already moving toward the boards on the wall, already running through the timeline in his head with the focused, methodical intensity of a man who had spent 20 years learning exactly how corrupt institutions eventually destroyed themselves. They panicked, and they moved too early, and they have just handed us the justification we needed to execute every single warrant tonight. Reyes stood up slowly. "Tonight we were planning for—" "I know what we were planning for." Davenport was already at the door. "Plans change. Get everyone on the phone, all units. We move in 3 hours." He almost didn't answer. It was late, he was tired. He had spent the last several weeks managing what could only be described as an increasingly precarious situation, and the arrest of the Mercer woman was supposed to have taken the pressure off, was supposed to have given everyone a few days of breathing room while she dealt with lawyers and charges and the absolute dismantling of the professional reputation she had spent years building. He answered, "Gordon." The voice on the other end was tight controlled, but underneath that control was something Hale had never heard from this particular man before: fear. "We have a problem." Hale set his glass down. "What kind of problem?" "The kind that involves the FBI." The silence that followed lasted approximately 3 seconds. To Hale, it felt much longer. "What are you talking about?" he said. "The FBI isn't—" Someone tipped them off, or they were already watching. "I don't know which, and right now it doesn't matter, Gordon. What matters is that I'm hearing things. Movement. People getting calls they shouldn't be getting. If they move tonight, they're not moving tonight. They can't move tonight. We have coverage. We had coverage." The voice cracked just slightly. "Past tense. I'm telling you, if you have anything in that office of yours that you don't want them to find, you have maybe a few hours, maybe less." Hale's hand tightened on the phone. He looked around his office, the filing cabinet in the corner, the locked drawer on the left side of his desk, the external hard drive he kept in the false bottom of his briefcase, because he'd always told himself it was just a precaution, just a safety measure, because men like him always needed to know where their leverage was. "Call the others," he said. "I've already tried. No one's picking up." The silence this time was different. "What do you mean no one's picking up?" "I mean," the voice said, and there was something terrible in it now. Something that sounded almost like the beginning of a very specific kind of breakdown. "That I've called 7 people in the last 20 minutes and not a single one of them has answered their phone. And that, Gordon, that is what I'm calling you about. New officers coming on." She listened to them joke with the outgoing shift, heard someone mention something about a food order, heard someone else complain about the cold. Normal, mundane, the ordinary machinery of a police station on a regular night. Except it wasn't a regular night. She knew that. She could feel it the way she had learned to feel things in the field, not with certainty, not with any specific information, but with the deep bone-level instinct of someone who had spent enough time in volatile situations to recognize the particular quality of the air right before everything changed. She closed her eyes. She thought about the first day she had ever suspected something was wrong. It had been an inventory discrepancy, small enough that most people would have chalked it up to clerical error and moved on. But Hannah was not most people, and clerical errors that repeated themselves with a consistent pattern across 6 months of hospital records were not errors at all. They were a system. She had started keeping her own records. Paper, not digital. Locked in a box she kept at home, not at the hospital. She had started taking photographs on a personal device she had bought secondhand for cash because she understood the way people who've served in the military sometimes understand that if someone was already aware of her and already watching her, they would be watching for mistakes, and she couldn't afford to make any. For 8 months, she hadn't made one. And now she was sitting in a holding cell because the people who were supposed to be untouchable had panicked. And panicking was the first kind of mistake. And first mistakes had a way of cascading. Not cruel, not mocking, just uncomfortable in the way people get when they have been asked to do something they're not sure about, but haven't yet found the courage to refuse. "You need anything else?" he asked. Hannah looked at him for a moment. She was a good reader of people, always had been. She could see the discomfort. She filed it away. "I'm fine," she said. "Thank you." He started to turn away. "Officer," she said, and he stopped. "What's your name?" He hesitated. "Barlow." "Officer Barlow." She kept her voice even, calm, completely without accusation. "When this is over, and it will be over, I hope you remember that you brought me water. I'll remember it. That matters more than you know right now." He stared at her for a moment like he was trying to figure out what to do with that. Then he walked away without another word, but he didn't look comfortable. And in Hannah's experience, uncomfortable people made choices. And choices in the right moment had a way of changing everything. Not one vehicle, not two. A coordinated convoy of FBI units, federal agents with warrants, forensic teams, and enough institutional authority to reach into every corner of a corrupt system and pull it out by the roots. Special Agent Davenport sat in the lead vehicle, his face completely calm, reviewing the final timeline on the tablet in his hands. 29 names, 29 sets of charges, locations across the city. The police department, City Hall, the administrative offices of Ridgewood Memorial Hospital, 3 private residences, and 2 commercial properties that had been operating as the distribution points for a multi-million-dollar theft and fraud network built on the backs of the very patients that hospital was supposed to serve. "Everyone confirmed position," he said into his radio. One by one, the confirmations came back. Clean, precise, the way these things went when you had months of preparation on your side and the element of surprise on top of it. "On my signal," Davenport said. And then he said something that his team would later recount in interviews, in depositions, and in the long years after Ridgewood Falls became the case, everyone used as an example of what happened when small-town corruption grew too bold and reached too far. He said very quietly, "Tonight we give a nurse her life back. Let's go." Not because of a technical failure, not because of a power outage, because the FBI walked through the front door with federal warrants, and the first thing they did was ask the desk officer politely, but with complete and unmistakable authority, to step away from the communications panel. Inside the holding cell, Hannah Mercer heard the change. She heard the voices shift from the casual, routine cadence of a station, running a normal late-night shift, to something different, something sharper, more urgent, more uncertain. She heard someone say clearly, and without any attempt to lower their voice, "This is a federal warrant. Everyone stand down." She sat very still. And for the first time since they had snapped those handcuffs on her wrists in the parking lot, Hannah Mercer allowed herself, just for a second, just one, to breathe. Because she had known, in the way you know things when you've been fighting for a very long time, and you understand in your bones what's at stake, that the night they arrested her was not the end of anything. It was the beginning. And somewhere on the other side of that holding cell door, the beginning was already well underway. The first thing Hannah heard was a voice she didn't recognize, firm, federal, and carrying the kind of authority that doesn't ask permission and doesn't repeat itself. "Nobody moves, nobody touches anything. If you have a weapon, you declare it right now." Then came the sound of chairs scraping, boots on linoleum, someone saying what the before being cut off, and underneath all of it, a low collective tension that Hannah could feel even through the concrete wall of the holding cell, the specific, unmistakable energy of a room full of people who had just realized that the story they thought they were in had completely changed. The woman across from her on the bench looked up for the first time in hours. "What's happening?" Hannah said nothing. She kept her hands steady on her knees. She kept her breathing even. She had learned a long time ago that the moments right before everything shifted were the most dangerous ones to lose your composure in. The young officer Barlow appeared at the cell door approximately 4 minutes later. His face had gone a particular shade of pale that Hannah associated with people who were rapidly recalculating how much trouble they were actually in. "Ms. Mercer," he said, and his voice came out quieter than he'd probably intended. There are federal agents here. They're asking for you." Hannah stood up slowly. She smoothed the front of her scrubs with both hands. She looked at Barlow with the same calm, measured expression she'd been holding on to for the last 3 hours, and she said, "I know." He stared at her. You, you knew. "I made a phone call," she said simply, "before they arrested me." The look on his face in that moment, the collision of confusion and dawning comprehension, and something that might have been the beginning of genuine alarm, was one Hannah would remember for a long time. Because it was the look of a man understanding for the first time that he had been a small piece in a game whose full board he had never been allowed to see. She walked past him toward the cell door, and he stepped aside without being asked. Special Agent Marcus Davenport was waiting for her in the hallway outside the processing area. He was a tall man, lean in the way people get when they run on adrenaline and institutional coffee, and he had the kind of face that didn't waste energy on unnecessary expression. He looked at Hannah the way a surgeon looks at a patient right before an operation, focused, precise, and completely without drama. "Ms. Mercer," he said, "are you injured?" "No." "Do you need medical attention?" "I need," Hannah said very carefully and very clearly, "someone to explain to me exactly what's happening in the next 60 seconds, because I have been sitting in that cell for 3 hours building a very specific picture of tonight's timeline in my head, and I need to know if I got it right." Something moved across Davenport's face. Not quite a smile, but close. "Walk with me." They moved through the station, and the scene around them was controlled. K's federal agents at every desk, every filing cabinet, open, officers standing in small groups with expressions ranging from stunned to furious, to the particular blankness of people who have decided that looking like they don't know anything is their best remaining option. Hannah clocked every face she passed. She filed every reaction. "We executed warrants at 6 locations simultaneously," Davenport said, his voice low and even as they walked. "The police department, City Hall, the hospital's administrative wing, 2 distribution sites, and Chief Hale's residence." Hannah stopped walking. "You went to Hale's house?" "We went to Hale's house." "Was he there?" "He was there," Davenport said. "He was also in the process of destroying documents when our agents came through the door, which, legally speaking, is not an ideal situation for a man who'd been claiming he had nothing to hide." Hannah absorbed this. She started walking again. "How many arrests?" "Tonight, 14 so far. By morning, we expect that number to be significantly higher. We have teams at City Hall right now. The mayor's security detail attempted to delay entry. That's going to be a problem for those individuals going forward." The mayor, them. Hannah said it like she was testing the weight of the words. She had known the mayor was involved. She had the documentation, the transaction records, the emails that had been deleted, and then critically, not actually deleted from the server to backup she had found access to through a contact she would never name out loud in a federal hallway. But knowing something and hearing it confirmed by a federal agent in the middle of an active raid were 2 very different experiences. William Carr Davenport confirmed, "We have him on obstruction, conspiracy, and about 4 other things that his very expensive lawyer is going to have a very difficult time untangling." They reached a quieter corridor. Davenport stopped. He turned to face her directly, and his expression shifted into something more human. Not soft exactly, but honest in a way that cut through the procedural language and the institutional distance. "Ms. Mercer, I want you to understand something. What you built over 8 months, the documentation, the records, the evidence chain you maintained, it is extraordinarily clean. In 20 years of this work, I have seen professional investigators make messier cases. You gave us a foundation that we were able to build an entire federal operation on. Without what you handed us tonight, doesn't happen." Hannah looked at him for a long moment. She felt something move through her chest that she immediately and firmly suppressed because she couldn't afford to feel it right now. Later, maybe. Not now. "I want my charges dropped," she said. "Tonight, not tomorrow, tonight. Already in motion. And I want it on record that what happened in that parking lot was a deliberate, coordinated attempt to intimidate a witness and obstruct a federal investigation. Also already in motion." Davenport's jaw tightened. "The officers who arrested you tonight are going to have an extremely educational morning." Hannah nodded once. "Then tell me what you need from me." What Davenport needed from her. What the FBI needed from her was her formal statement, her documented account of every step she had taken over the past 8 months, every piece of evidence she had collected and where she had collected it, every name she had encountered, and how, and the specific moment-by-moment record of what she had seen and when. It was the kind of statement that would take hours and that would be picked apart and scrutinized and cross-referenced against everything the federal teams were pulling out of filing cabinets and hard drives and servers across Ridgewood Falls at this very moment. But before any of that could begin, Davenport's phone rang. He answered it, listened for approximately 10 seconds, and then said, "Say that again." A pause. "When?" Another pause. His expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes, the specific recalibration of a person receiving information that expands the problem beyond what they'd originally calculated. He ended the call. He looked at Hannah with an expression that was very carefully neutral. "We have a development," he said. "What kind of development?" "The kind that involves a name you're going to recognize." Hannah had known somewhere in the deep down part of her that she had been avoiding since she got those handcuffs off her wrists that this moment was coming. She had known it the way you know things you're not ready to face, with a kind of cold peripheral awareness that you keep out of your direct line of sight, because looking at it straight on is something you're not prepared to do until you absolutely have to. "Tell me," she said. Davenport said the name. "Dr. Patricia Frost." The hallway was very quiet. Hannah breathed in slowly. She breathed out. "What did you find?" she asked. Her voice was completely steady. She was very proud of that. "Communications," Davenport said. "Dating back approximately 14 months. She was in contact with 3 of the primary conspirators on a regular basis. We're still working through the full scope of what she knew and what she passed along, but she knew about me." Hannah said it before he could. "She knew I was investigating. She told them." Davenport was quiet for exactly 1 second. "That's what the early evidence suggests, yes. 14 months. Hannah ran the number backward in her head through every conversation, every shift, every moment. She had trusted the woman who had mentored her through her first year at Ridgewood Memorial, who had written her recommendation letters, who had called her brilliant and principled, and exactly the kind of nurse the system needed. Every time she had been careful to say nothing at work that could give her away, every precaution she had taken. Every misdirection she had used to protect her investigation, and the whole time there had been someone sitting right next to her at every staff meeting, in every lunch break, in every quiet hallway conversation, who was feeding information to the people she was trying to bring down. "How much did she give them?" Hannah asked. "We don't know yet. Enough that they were aware of you and watching you. Not enough that they moved against you until tonight, which suggests she either didn't know the full extent of what you'd built, or she was, for whatever reason, giving them incomplete information." Hannah thought about that. She turned it over. Because here was the thing about Patricia Frost. Here was the thing that Hannah, even now in this hallway, with everything collapsing around both of them, couldn't quite set aside. She had known Patricia Frost for 6 years. She had watched her fight for patients in circumstances where fighting was the harder choice. She had seen her make enemies of administrators to protect a single nurse who was being treated unfairly. She had seen her cry once outside the door of a patient's room in a way that people only cry when something has genuinely broken through their professional armor. Patricia Frost was not a monster. She was something more complicated and in some ways more troubling than a monster. She was a person who had made a series of choices, or possibly had been forced into a series of choices that had landed her on the wrong side of this line, and that Hannah realized was going to hurt in ways that the arrest and the charges and the holding cell and all of it combined had not managed to hurt. "I need a minute," she said. "Take 2, Davenport said, and walked a careful distance away. Hannah stood in that federal hallway, and she looked at the wall in front of her, and she let herself feel for exactly the 120 seconds she had requested the full weight of what Patricia Frost's name in this investigation meant. The grief of it, the fury of it, the specific disorienting vertigo of discovering that someone you had trusted completely had been in some form, to some degree, an instrument of the very machine she had spent 8 months trying to dismantle. Then she straightened her spine. She turned around. She walked back to where Davenport was standing and waiting with the particular patience of a man who understood that some 2-minute pauses had to be given their full space. "All right," she said, "let's go." While Hannah began her formal statement in a secured room at the back of the station, the rest of Ridgewood Falls was waking up to something it didn't yet have words for. Federal vehicles outside City Hall, lights on in administrative offices that were normally dark by 9. A black SUV parked outside the mayor's residence, with 2 agents standing at the front door waiting with the steady, unhurried certainty of people who had all night and all the paperwork they needed. Inside City Hall, an aide named Jennifer Pell was sitting at her desk at 2 in the morning because Jennifer Pell had been working late, as she often did, as she had been doing for the past 3 years, in a job she was quietly beginning to understand she had been kept in specifically because she was diligent and detail-oriented and asked very few questions, when 2 federal agents walked past her desk without stopping and went directly into the deputy mayor's office. She heard the deputy mayor say, "What in God's name?" and then something lower, and then the door was shut. Jennifer sat very still at her desk. She looked at her computer screen. She looked at the folder she had been working from, which contained, among other things, a series of budget allocations that she had flagged internally 3 months ago as irregular, and had been told by her direct supervisor with a smile that she had not quite been able to interpret at the time not to worry about. She thought about that conversation now. She thought about it quite specifically. And then she picked up her personal cell phone and called her sister. Something's happening, she said when her sister picked up groggy and confused. At City Hall. There are federal agents everywhere. I think I need a lawyer. Her sister said, Jennifer, it's 2 a.m. I know what time it is, Jennifer said. Get me a number. 3 blocks away from City Hall in a high-rise apartment that costs more per month than most Ridgewood Falls residents made in 3. A man named Deputy Administrator Robert Crane was standing in his living room in his bathrobe on the phone saying the same 4 words over and over with increasing desperation. We had a deal. We had a deal. We had a deal. The person on the other end of that call had already hung up by the second repetition. Robert Crane was talking to dead air, and some part of him understood that, but the 4 words kept coming anyway because they were the only 4 words his brain was producing right now, and stopping them would mean accepting what stopping them meant. The knock on his door, when it came, was professional and firm and not particularly loud. He opened the door in his bathrobe phone still in his hand and looked at the 2 federal agents standing in his hallway with an expression that a colleague would later describe with a kind of helpless honesty as the face of a man watching a wall fall on him in slow motion. Robert Crane, the lead agent said. I want a lawyer, Crane said, immediately. Before anything else, before yes, or that's me, or any other response that might constitute cooperation without counsel. That is absolutely your right, the agent said pleasantly. In the meantime, we have a warrant to search these premises. Please step to the side. Crane stepped to the side. He sat down on his couch in his bathrobe. He put his phone face down on the cushion beside him. He stared at the floor and thought about the specific sequence of decisions that had brought him to this moment, and whether any single one of them made differently might have led somewhere else. He had been thinking about that for a long time, actually. He just hadn't expected to be thinking about it in front of federal agents in his bathrobe at 2:15 in the morning. Back at the station, Hannah was 40 minutes into her statement when the agent across from her paused, looked at something on his laptop, and said very carefully, Ms. Mercer, I need to ask you about something. She waited. The documentation you maintained on the supply chain diversion, the records you kept of shipments being rerouted and resold. Can you tell us who your source was inside the logistics department? The person who gave you access to the internal shipping records. Hannah had been expecting this question since approximately the 3rd week of her investigation. She had prepared for it. She had thought through her answer with the same care she'd brought to every other decision in the past 8 months. I can give you everything the records show, she said. The records speak for themselves. As for my source, I'm going to ask you to let me speak to a lawyer before I answer that question. The agent nodded, wrote something down. Understood. But I want you to understand something, Hannah said. The person who gave me access to those records did it because they were scared. They did it because they worked inside a system that was stealing from patients from sick people who came to that hospital, trusting that someone was taking care of them, and they had nowhere to turn. I will tell you what you need to know, but I will not throw someone under a bus for having the courage to help me do the right thing. The agent looked at her for a moment. Then he said in a tone that was quieter than his previous professional register, That's fair, Ms. Mercer. It was nearly 4 in the morning when Davenport came back into the room with an expression that Hannah had already learned to read the specific look he got when something had shifted in a way that mattered. We pulled the financial records from the hospital's secondary accounts, he said, the ones the board didn't know about. He sat down across from her. The number is larger than we initially projected. How much larger, he told her. Hannah sat back in her chair. She was not a person easily shocked. She was a woman who had seen things in combat zones and emergency rooms that most people spent their whole lives hoping not to imagine. But the number Davenport said, the raw, staggering, infuriating dollar amount that had been systematically drained from a hospital that was perpetually short-staffed and perpetually under-resourced, while nurses like her worked double shifts and patients went without that number, hit her somewhere deep and specific and genuinely furious. Those were patient funds, she said. Her voice came out low and tight. Medication budgets, equipment, staffing. That money was supposed to... I know, Davenport said. People died, Hannah said, in that hospital, on understaffed shifts, with equipment that was overdue for replacement, because the budget was... She stopped. She pressed her fingers flat on the table and breathed. Is that in the charges? Is that documented? It will be. Make sure it is, she said. Make sure that number is in every charge sheet and every press statement and every court filing. Make sure no one gets to reduce this to a financial crime and lose the part where people were hurt. Davenport held her gaze. I promise you, he said, it will be documented. Outside Ridgewood Falls was still dark, still quiet on the surface. The way places are quiet right before everything changes, before the sun comes up and the morning news goes live, and the people who thought they were untouchable are walked out of buildings in handcuffs while cameras roll. Hannah Mercer sat in a federal interview room with a paper cup of coffee growing cold in front of her, and she thought about every shift she had worked in that hospital while the theft was happening all around her, every patient she had sat with, every colleague who had burned out and quit because the resources were never enough. Every decision she had made over 8 months to keep going, keep documenting, keep trusting that the truth she was building piece by careful piece would eventually be enough. It was enough. It was more than enough. And the night was not over yet. The first light of morning hit Ridgewood Falls at 6:14, and by then the city had already been fundamentally altered in ways that most of its residents wouldn't fully understand until they turned on their televisions with their first cup of coffee and saw the words scrolling across the bottom of the screen, Federal Raid. Ridgewood Falls, 29 arrested, corruption network spanning multiple city departments. Hannah saw those words reflected in the window of the conference room where she had been sitting for the past 4 hours. She didn't turn around to look at the television directly. She just watched the reflection, the red and white of the news chyron moving across the glass, and let herself understand that the thing she had been building alone in the dark for 8 months was now out in the world where no one could put it back. Davenport came back into the room at 6:20 with 2 coffees and the expression of a man who had not slept and did not intend to. "The press is outside," he said, setting one of the cups in front of her. "I know," she said. She had heard the distant sound of vehicles pulling up, the specific frequency of a media crowd assembling, the overlapping voices, the equipment, the controlled urgency of journalists who understood they were standing outside something that was going to be the story for a long time. "We're holding a press conference at 8, Davenport said. "The U.S. Attorney's Office is sending someone. The FBI's Public Affairs Unit is already here. You don't have to be part of it. That's entirely your choice." "What do you want me to do?" Hannah asked. Davenport sat down across from her. "Honestly, I want you standing at that podium. Not because we need you there for the case, because the story of what happened here, the human story, not the legal one, that matters. And you are that story." Hannah wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. She thought about it for exactly as long as it took her to run through the range of outcomes on both sides of the decision. She thought about what it would mean to stand in front of cameras while she was still wearing the same scrubs she'd been arrested in, while her name was still technically attached to fabricated charges that were being dropped but hadn't been formally cleared yet, while somewhere across the city, Patricia Frost was either being arrested or had already been arrested and was going through her own version of the worst night of her life. She thought about the patients. She always came back to the patients. The man in room 412 last fall who had needed a specific medication that had taken 3 days longer than it should have to arrive because the supply chain was compromised, and nobody at the administrative level seemed to think that was worth prioritizing. She had never been able to prove that the delay was connected to the theft. She had always suspected it was. "I'll be there," she said. What happened in the 2 hours between that decision and the press conference was the kind of compressed high-velocity sequence of events that Hannah would later struggle to explain to people who asked because it happened too fast and too dense to be properly narrativized in the moment. There was a formal notification that her charges had been dropped. There was a conversation with a federal attorney named Solace who had a precise, authoritative manner and walked Hannah through what her role as a key witness would look like in the coming months, the depositions, the grand jury proceedings, the eventual trial preparation. There was a phone call she made to her sister in Atlanta, the only family she had within 1,500 miles, that lasted 4 minutes and ended with her sister saying, "I'm getting on a plane," and Hannah saying, "You don't have to," and her sister saying, "Hannah, I'm getting on a plane." And then there was a knock on the conference room door, and when Davenport opened it, the agent on the other side said very quickly, "We have a situation with Dr. Frost." Davenport looked at Hannah. She was already on her feet. "What kind of situation?" she asked. "She's asking to speak with you," the agent said. "Before she's processed, she's specifically asking for Ms. Mercer." The room went very still. Davenport turned to Hannah with an expression that was professionally neutral, but had something underneath it that might have been concern. "You don't have to do that. You absolutely do not have to do that." "I know," Hannah said. "It could compromise." "I know what it could do," Hannah said. "I want to hear what she has to say." They brought Patricia Frost into a small room off the main corridor. And when Hannah walked in and saw the woman who had written her letters of recommendation and told her she had the sharpest clinical instincts of any nurse she'd mentored. Or in 20 years, the thing that struck her first was not the anger, though the anger was there. What struck her first was how small Patricia looked. Not physically, she was the same height, the same composed posture that Hannah had always associated with her, but something essential had gone out of her, the way a building looks smaller once the scaffolding comes down, and you can see what was actually holding it up all along. "Hannah," Patricia said. "Dr. Frost," Hannah said. She didn't sit down. She stood near the door with her arms at her sides and her expression even, because whatever she was feeling right now, she was not going to hand it to this woman until she understood what she was looking at. I need you to know something, Patricia said. I need you to understand what I did, what I was part of. I didn't do it willingly. Not in the beginning. How does it work in the beginning? Hannah asked. Walk me through it, because I genuinely want to understand. Patricia looked at her hands. It started 3 years ago, before you even came to Ridgewood Memorial. There was a procurement contract hospital, supplies, nothing dramatic. I was approached by Administrator Crane. He said they needed physician sign-off on adjusted inventory numbers. It seemed like a paperwork issue. It seemed small. It wasn't small. No, Patricia said quietly. It wasn't. But by the time I understood how far it went, by the time I understood what I'd already signed my name to, they had enough to end my career and everything I'd spent 30 years building. She looked up. I'm not telling you this to excuse it. I'm telling you because I need you to know that when I realized you were investigating, when they came to me and asked what you knew, I didn't give them everything. Hannah went very still. What did you give them? I told them you had suspicions. I didn't tell them about the backup documentation. I didn't tell them you had contacts outside the hospital. I deliberately kept the information incomplete. Patricia's voice broke just slightly. I know that's not enough. I know that doesn't undo anything. But Hannah, I want you to know I was trying. In the only way I had left, I was trying. Hannah looked at her for a long time. She thought about the 14 months of calls and meetings and quiet observations. She thought about the fact that she was standing in a federal building having this conversation because she had not been stopped, because the information Patricia had provided had been incomplete enough that the people who wanted to stop her had waited too long and moved too late. She thought about whether incomplete protection given at enormous personal risk by someone who was already trapped counted as something. She didn't have an answer. She suspected she wouldn't have one for a long time. I have to go, Hannah said. There's a press conference in an hour, and I'm going to out there. Whatever you told them or didn't tell them, Dr. Frost, the evidence speaks for itself, and it's going to speak very loudly. Patricia nodded. She looked like she wanted to say something else. Hannah walked out before she could. Davenport was waiting in the hallway. He fell into step beside her without a word, and they walked back toward the conference room. And it was 30 seconds before he said, You okay? No, Hannah said. But I will be. What's the update on the arrests? Davenport pulled out his tablet as they walked. As of an hour ago, 23 in custody. We expect to hit 29 by end of day. We have 6 individuals who went to lawyers first. We're working through the formal surrender process on those. The mayor's attorney filed an emergency motion at 5 this morning that went nowhere. Mayor Carr is currently at the Federal Processing Center. And Chief Hale destroyed approximately 40 pages of documents before our agents got to him. Unfortunately for him, he didn't know we already had digital copies of most of what he was shredding from the server backup you identified. So what he actually accomplished was adding evidence tampering to his existing charges. Hannah almost smiled. He didn't know about the server backup. Nobody knew about the server backup except you and the 2 agents you gave it to 6 weeks ago. Davenport glanced at her. You want to tell me how you found it? I want to tell my lawyer, and then my lawyer can decide what to tell you, she said. This time Davenport actually did smile briefly and without apology. Fair. They were passing through the main area of the station when Hannah heard her name, not spoken said, with a particular quality of voice that made her stop and turn around. Officer Barlow was standing near the break room door. He looked like he hadn't moved in several hours, which was probably because he hadn't. He had the expression of a young man who had spent the night watching everything he thought he understood about his workplace and his colleagues and his professional home get systematically dismantled, and who was now standing in the wreckage of that understanding, trying to figure out what, if anything, was left. He said, I didn't know. Hannah looked at him. She believed him. She believed him because she had read people for a long time and because innocence and guilt have different textures that become distinguishable once you've seen enough of both. I know you didn't, she said. The officers who arrested you, Pruitt and Kovach, they told us it was routine. They said you were flagged in the system. Nobody questioned it. He swallowed. I should have questioned it. Yes, Hannah said, you should have. She let that sit for a moment because he needed to sit with it. Then she said, but you brought me water, and you remember that I told you it mattered. Barlow, figure out what kind of officer you want to be going forward. You are young enough to still make that choice clearly. He nodded. He looked like he might say something else, but Hannah had already turned away because she had 17 minutes before the press conference briefing, and there were things she needed to think through. The U.S. Attorney's representative was a woman named Diane Cho, sharp-eyed and efficient, who briefed Hannah and Davenport in a room off the main entrance with the focused economy of someone who had done this many times and understood that clarity was more useful than reassurance. The charges filed this morning represent the initial wave, Cho said. We're looking at federal conspiracy, wire fraud, theft of government-funded medical supplies, bribery of public officials, obstruction of justice, and in 4 cases civil rights violations connected to the arrest of Ms. Mercer last night. As the investigation continues, we anticipate additional charges. Additional individuals? Davenport asked. Cho looked at him. We've had 4 calls this morning from individuals in adjacent counties who have retained attorneys and indicated they have information relevant to the investigation. 2 of those individuals appear to be connected to distribution networks that go significantly beyond Ridgewood Falls. The room went quiet. Hannah said, "How far beyond?" Cho set her folder down on the table. This was the moment Hannah could feel it before the words came, the specific atmospheric shift of a revelation that expands the entire frame of what you thought you were looking at. Based on the financial records recovered last night, Cho said carefully, we believe this network operated across parts of at least 3 states. Ridgewood Falls was not the center of this operation. It was a node. The silence after that was profound. Hannah thought about everything she had documented, every transaction record, every shipping manifest, every discrepancy she had flagged and followed. She had believed she had been certain that Ridgewood Memorial Hospital was the epicenter of something large and self-contained. She had never imagined she was looking at one piece of something much larger. How many people are we talking about? She asked. We don't have a final number yet, Cho said, but the 29 arrests in Ridgewood Falls are the beginning of a federal investigation that is now significantly larger than any of us projected 24 hours ago. Davenport leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he looked at Hannah. And Hannah looked at the folder on the table and thought about the fact that she had started this because of an inventory discrepancy, because of a number that didn't add up, because she was the kind of person who could not look at something that was wrong and pretend it was fine. She was a nurse. She fixed what was broken. It was the only thing she had ever known how to be. Okay, she said, what do you need from me for the press conference? Cho opened her folder. A statement. Your own words. I would strongly advise against anything scripted. The public is going to respond to authenticity here, and you have an authentic story. We want you to speak to who you are, what you witnessed, and why you did what you did. We are not asking you to characterize any individual defendants or speak to the legal details. Just tell the truth. Hannah almost laughed. Tell the truth, as if she had been doing anything else for 8 months. The press conference was held on the steps of the federal building, and by the time the FBI's public affairs officer stepped up to the first microphone, the crowd outside had grown to something Hannah hadn't fully anticipated, not just journalists and cameras and satellite trucks, but people. Residents of Ridgewood Falls who had driven to the federal building at 7:30 in the morning because they had seen the news and needed to see for themselves. Hospital workers in scrubs who had just come off shifts or were on their way to shifts. People holding phones up recording. People standing with their arms crossed and their expressions carrying the complex weight of a community that had just been told in the starkest possible terms that the institution it depended on for its most vulnerable moments had been systematically betrayed. Hannah stood to the side while the FBI's representative read the initial statement. She heard the charges enumerated. She heard the number 29 said out loud in front of cameras and felt its weight differently than she had every other time she'd heard it in the past few hours, because here it was public. Here, it was real in the way that things become real when they exist in the shared air of a community rather than in a conference room. When the representative said, I'd like to invite Ms. Hannah Mercer to say a few words, and the crowd's energy shifted, tightened, focused, turned toward her. Hannah walked to the microphone without looking at anyone in particular and without any notes in her hand. She stood there for exactly 1 second before she spoke. 1 second in which she felt all of it, the handcuffs in the holding cell, and Patricia Frost's face and Davenport's voice saying the number, and the knowledge that somewhere across 3 states, a network she had helped expose was now unraveling in ways she couldn't fully track. She felt all of it, and she breathed through it, and then she opened her mouth. My name is Hannah Mercer, she said. I'm a nurse. I'm also a veteran. And for the past 8 months, I've been documenting what I can only describe as a deliberate, organized theft from the people that hospital was built to serve. She paused. I was arrested last night in the parking lot of Ridgewood Memorial Hospital on charges that were fabricated. I want the people of this city to understand clearly they arrested me because they were afraid of what I had found. And what they did not understand, what they fundamentally miscalculated, is that arresting me didn't stop anything. It accelerated everything. The crowd was absolutely silent. I am not a hero, Hannah continued. I am a nurse who found something wrong and could not pretend I hadn't found it. That is the beginning and end of what this is. The people who were arrested last night, they made a choice to use their authority and their access to steal from sick people. And the people of Ridgewood Falls deserve to know that and deserve better. And I intend to spend a great deal of time in the coming months making sure they get it. She stepped back from the microphone. The crowd erupted not in celebration exactly, but in something raw and more complicated than celebration. Voices applauded the sound of people releasing something they hadn't known they were holding. Davenport was beside her in seconds. That, he said quietly, was exactly right. Hannah nodded. She looked out at the crowd and thought about everything that was still ahead. The depositions, the trials, the civil lawsuit, the long institutional reckoning that would take months and probably years and would require her to relive everything she had documented in the precise, exhausting detail that legal proceedings demanded. She thought about Patricia Frost in that small room looking at her hands. She thought about Officer Barlow and the paper cup of water. She thought about the number Diane Cho had not yet been ready to give her, the number of people across 3 states who were even now waking up to the knowledge that the thing they had built and profited from was no longer hidden. And she thought about something Marcus Davenport had said in that federal hallway hours ago when everything was still in motion and the night was just beginning to break open. Tonight we give a nurse her life back. She was going to hold him to that. Every day for as long as it took, she was going to hold all of them to it. Because the 29 arrests were not the end. Diane Cho had made that clear. The network was larger. The reach was wider. And Hannah Mercer, who had started this with a notebook and a secondhand phone and the stubborn, unshakable conviction that what she was seeing was real and that real things demanded a real response, Hannah Mercer was not done. Not even close. The applause outside the federal building hadn't fully faded before the first attack came. Not a physical attack. Something more calculated than that. Something designed not to hurt Hannah's body, but to dismantle the one thing she had spent 8 months building with more care than anything else in her professional life, her credibility. It started on social media, which was how these things always started now, with someone who didn't use their real name posting a thread that began with the words, "Let's talk about what Hannah Mercer isn't telling you." The thread went up at 8:47 in the morning, less than 20 minutes after Hannah stepped away from that microphone. By 9:15, it had been shared 4,000 times. By 10 o'clock, a local news affiliate had picked it up and was running a chyron that said in the particular language of outlets that want to imply doubt without technically stating it, "Federal witness Hannah Mercer questions emerge about her past." Hannah found out about it the way she found out about most things that day from Davenport, who came to find her in the conference room where she'd been sitting with her coffee going cold again, and who sat down across from her and put his phone face up on the table so she could read it. She read it. She put the phone back down. "Who?" she said. "We're working on that," Davenport said. "The account was created 4 days ago, which means someone was preparing this before last night, which means someone in the network anticipated that the arrest might not go the way they planned and had a contingency." What does it say specifically? Davenport hesitated for exactly 1 second in a way that told Hannah the hesitation was purposeful. He was giving her a breath before the impact. "It's claiming that you were involved in a disciplinary review at your previous hospital 3 years ago. It characterizes it as a termination for cause." Hannah felt something move through her chest, not quite anger, not quite the more complicated thing underneath the anger. "I was not terminated. I resigned while an investigation was pending, and the investigation cleared me completely. It was a documentation dispute over a patient discharge record. Every document related to that exists. It's on record." "I know," Davenport said. "Then why are you looking at me like that?" "Because the documentation dispute," Davenport said carefully, "is not what the thread is actually focused on. The thread is implying that the investigation itself was connected to missing medication records. It's not stating it directly, it's using the specific deliberate language of implication. Isn't it interesting that some are asking whether it's structured to make people connect dots that don't connect?" Hannah was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "They're trying to make it look like I'm the drug thief, that the charges from last night, the ones they fabricated, had a basis. Yes. They're using my past to retroactively legitimize a false arrest. Yes. That is," Hannah said with a precision of tone that she thought was probably remarkable given how she was actually feeling, an extraordinarily cynical thing to do. "It is," Davenport agreed. "It is also a move we've seen before when corrupt networks are cornered. They don't go quietly. They look for anything they can use to muddy the water around the primary witness." Hannah stood up. She walked to the window and stood with her back to Davenport for a moment. Outside, she could hear that the media crowd was still there, though its energy had shifted from the focused attention of the press conference to the restless ambient buzz of journalists working their phones and comparing notes. She thought about the 3-year-old disciplinary review. She thought about how hard she had fought to clear her name at the time, how the investigation had eventually concluded that she had done nothing wrong, how she had resigned anyway because staying in an environment where colleagues had been encouraged to question her integrity had felt untenable. She thought about moving to Ridgewood Falls specifically because it was a fresh start, a place where no one knew that story, a place where she could be just a nurse doing her job. And now that story was being pulled out of the vault and rewritten and handed to 4,000 strangers on the internet as evidence of something it had never been evidence of. She turned around. What do we do? 2 things, Davenport said. First, your attorney and I strongly recommend you formally retain one today, not tomorrow. Today issues a statement with the complete documentation from that disciplinary review. Full clearance, full record. Don't let the implication breathe any longer than it already has. Second, we track the account. We find out who's running this and where the coordination is coming from. Because this isn't spontaneous, Hannah. This is organized, and organized means there's a thread we can pull. Pull it, she said. Her attorney was a woman named Carol Vega, who had been recommended by Davenport's team and who arrived at the federal building at 10:30 with the brisk, no-nonsense energy of someone who had handled exactly this kind of situation before, and found other people's attempts at character assassination more irritating than intimidating. She was in her mid-50s, wore no makeup, and had a handshake that communicated she was absolutely not interested in wasting time. I've already reviewed the disciplinary file from your previous hospital, Vega said, sitting across from Hannah with a tablet and a legal pad. Complete exoneration, properly documented, no ambiguity. We'll have a public statement out within the hour. She paused. I want to talk to you about something else. The lawsuit, Hannah said. Vega raised an eyebrow. You've thought about this already. I've been thinking about it since about 20 minutes after they arrested me. Good. Vega leaned forward. Because what happened to you in that parking lot last night was not a mistake. It was not an overzealous officer making a bad call. It was a coordinated, deliberate attempt by individuals in positions of public authority to use the power of law enforcement or a weapon against a private citizen who was cooperating with a federal investigation. That is a civil rights violation. It is also, she said, with the particular precision of an attorney finding exactly the right word, expensive, both for the individuals involved and for the city of Ridgewood Falls. I don't want their money, Hannah said. I know you don't, Vega said. But what a civil rights lawsuit does beyond the money, beyond the individual accountability, is force institutional reform. It forces the city to examine and restructure the systems that allowed this to happen. It creates a legal record that cannot be erased. And it sends a message to every other municipality where people in positions of authority think they can use a badge as a tool of intimidation. She looked at Hannah directly. This is not about your bank account. This is about making sure the next Hannah Mercer in the next town, in the next hospital, doesn't get arrested in a parking lot for doing the right thing. Hannah was quiet. I'll need some time, she said finally. You have until tomorrow, Vega said without any apology for the timeline. The news cycle moves fast. If we're filing, we want to file while this is still the story, while the public attention is on Ridgewood Falls and what happened here. After a week, this becomes a legal proceeding that nobody's watching. Right now, it's still something people care about. Use that. Hannah nodded. Vega stood, gathered her materials, and then paused at the door. One more thing, she said, and there was something different in her voice now, something that wasn't quite her professional register. I read about what you built over 8 months. The documentation, the evidence chain, the way you maintained it. She paused. My daughter is a nurse at a hospital in Cincinnati. I've been asking her for years to trust her instincts about the things she sees at work. She held Hannah's gaze for a moment. Thank you for reminding her and me what that actually looks like. She walked out. Hannah sat alone in the room for the first time in hours and felt the full weight of the day settle around her like something physical. By noon, the social media thread had been countered by the official release of her complete disciplinary record, and the local news affiliate that had run the Chiron quietly removed it from their coverage without comment or apology. The specific institutional cowardice of outlets that amplify damage and then disappear when that damage is shown to be false. Carol Vega had also, with remarkable efficiency, sent letters to 3 separate journalists who had referenced the thread without verification, putting them formally on notice that further publication of unverified claims about Hannah Mercer would be considered defamatory. Davenport had news of his own by early afternoon. The account that had started the thread had been traced not definitively, not yet, but with enough specificity to give the federal investigation a direction. It connected to a digital communications firm that had done work for the Ridgewood Falls mayor's office. The firm was not on the original list of 29. It was now on a new and expanding list that Davenport's team was building with the focused intensity of people who understood they had caught one edge of something much larger and were not going to let it go. Two of the individuals who called us this morning, Davenport told her, when he found her in the hallway outside the conference room eating a sandwich that someone had brought in because she hadn't eaten since the previous afternoon, are from a city called Delwood, about 90 miles north of here. Supply chain administrators. They've retained attorneys, and they want to make a deal. Hannah stopped chewing. Delwood, I've seen that name. Davenport looked at her carefully. Where, in the shipping records, there were 2 entries I thought they were data errors because they didn't match any hospital vendor I could identify. I flagged them in my documentation. She set down the sandwich. They weren't errors, were they? No, Davenport said, and they were not. So Ridgewood Memorial was receiving stolen supplies from somewhere, or sending them, or both. Both, Davenport said. We're still mapping the full network, but the early picture suggests that Ridgewood Memorial was both a recipient and a distribution point. Medical supplies, some of them controlled some equipment, were coming in through falsified vendor accounts, being partially redistributed to facilities and buyers across the region, and the revenue was being filtered through a series of shell accounts. He paused. We're now looking at somewhere between 40 and 60 individuals across 3 states. Hannah put both hands flat on the table in front of her. 40 to 60. That's the early estimate. It will likely be higher. She thought about the inventory discrepancy she had first noticed. The small number that hadn't matched. The thread she had started pulling, not knowing it would unravel something of this size. She felt something that wasn't quite vertigo, but was in the neighborhood the sensation of a problem recalibrating itself against a background that kept expanding. Are the patients at other hospitals? She started. We have teams reaching out to the medical administrations of 11 facilities across the 3 states, Davenport said, and his voice was precise and careful the way it got when he was being honest about something he knew was hard to hear. There will be patient impact reviews. We don't have a full picture yet. But yes, if this network operated the way we think it did, then Ridgewood Memorial was not the only hospital where supply diversion affected patient care. Hannah closed her eyes for exactly 3 seconds. She thought about what that meant. She thought about it in the specific clinical way of someone who understood hospital supply chains, what it meant for a surgical unit to have incorrect inventory counts, what it meant for a pharmacy to receive partial shipments that were documented as complete, what it meant for a patient in a bed somewhere 90 miles away who never knew that the medication delay or the equipment substitution they experienced was not a logistics failure, but a deliberate theft. When she opened her eyes, something in her face had settled into a hardness that hadn't been there before. Not anger. She'd been operating on anger for 8 months, and she knew its texture by now. This was something more durable than anger. This was the particular resolve of someone who has just understood that the problem is bigger than they thought and has made the decision in real time to be bigger than the problem. What do you need from me, she said, to help you map the whole network? Davenport looked at her for a moment. You've been awake for over 30 hours. You've been arrested, processed, released, given testimony, held a press conference, and had your professional reputation attacked on the internet. I don't think Marcus, Hannah said, and it was the first time she'd used his first name, and both of them registered it. What do you need? He held her gaze. Then he reached into the folder under his arm and pulled out a set of shipping manifests and set them on the table in front of her. Walk me through everything you remember about the Delwood entries, he said. She pulled the papers toward her and started talking. She talked for 2 hours. She pulled details from memory with a precision that made Davenport's analyst, a young agent named Torres, who was sitting to the side with a laptop, look up from his screen 3 or 4 times with an expression of barely concealed astonishment. Because Hannah didn't just remember the numbers, she remembered the context around the numbers, which shifts she'd been working when she'd noticed specific discrepancies, which colleagues had been on duty, which administrative events had coincided with particular irregularities in the supply records. She had been building a mental model of this network for 8 months, and the mental model was extraordinarily detailed. At one point, Torres said very quietly, and not quite to anyone specific, she should have been an analyst. She should have been left alone to do her job, Hannah said, without looking up from the manifest in front of her. It was mid-afternoon when the knock came on the conference room door, and an agent entered with a look that Davenport read immediately because he stood up before the agent had said a word. What happened? Davenport asked. Crane, the agent said. Robert Crane, the deputy administrator. He's been in a holding facility since this morning. He asked to speak to a lawyer 6 hours ago. The lawyer arrived 40 minutes ago, and 15 minutes ago, Crane told his lawyer he wants to make a deal. The room went very still. What kind of deal? Davenport said. He says he has records, specifically documentation of payments made to individuals we don't have on our list yet. He's characterizing them as significant. He says if we want the names, he wants full cooperation consideration. Davenport looked at Hannah. Hannah looked at Davenport. How significant is significant, she asked. The agent glanced at his notes. His exact words were, tell them I can give them the people above the mayor. The silence that followed was absolute. Above the mayor. Hannah turned those 3 words over. In her 8 months of investigation, Mayor William Carr had been the top of the visible structure, the highest authority she had been able to connect directly to the network. She had always suspected there were relationships she couldn't see from where she was standing, contacts above the local level, political cover that went higher than a small city mayor could generate on his own. She had documented what she could document and trusted the FBI to find what she couldn't reach. Someone above the mayor. State level possibly higher. He's credible, Davenport asked the agent. His attorney says the documentation is physical, hard copies. He kept them at a location that wasn't searched this morning. He's offering to hand them over personally as part of the cooperation agreement. Davenport nodded once sharp and decisive. Set up the meeting tonight. He turned to Hannah. I need you to step out of this part. What Crane tells us goes into a parallel track of the investigation. It can't be contaminated by direct witness involvement at this stage. I understand, Hannah said. She paused. But Marcus, when you know who's above the mayor, I want to know too. You'll know, he said. I promise. She stepped out. She walked down the corridor and found a quiet corner and stood there and let herself think about Robert Crane in his bathrobe at 2 a.m. saying we had a deal to dead air. She thought about the specific architecture of people who build systems of corruption, the way they always believe the deal will hold, right up until the moment it doesn't. Right up until someone else in the system decides that their own survival matters more than the collective silence. Someone above the mayor. She pressed her back against the wall and looked at the ceiling and breathed. Her phone, her personal cell, which had been returned to her along with her other property at 9 that morning, buzzed in her pocket. A text from her sister landed. Getting a rental. Where are you? Hannah typed back. Federal building on Commerce. Come here, I need to see a face I trust. Her sister replied in 3 seconds. 20 minutes. Hannah slid the phone back into her pocket. She thought about what Carol Vega had said about the lawsuit. She thought about what Davenport had said about 40 to 60 individuals. She thought about Patricia Frost's face and Officer Barlow's face, and the face of the agent who had just told them that Robert Crane wanted to give up the people above the mayor. She thought about the inventory discrepancy, the small number that hadn't matched. 8 months ago, before any of this, before the notebooks and the secondhand phone and the careful, exhausting architecture of documentation she had built before all of it, there had been just that, a number that was wrong, and the inability which she had never been able to explain or apologize for or reason herself out of to pretend she hadn't seen it. When her sister arrived 20 minutes later and walked through the door of the federal building and across the lobby and stopped in front of Hannah and said, "Oh my God, you look terrible." Hannah laughed, not a polished laugh or a composed laugh or the kind of laugh you produce to reassure people. A real one. Loud and unguarded and startled out of her by the sheer ordinary human relief of having someone in front of her who loved her and had gotten on a plane. Her sister hugged her. Hard. And Hannah, who had not allowed herself to properly feel anything since those handcuffs clicked shut in the parking lot at Ridgewood Memorial, felt something crack open in her chest that she was not going to apologize for. I'm okay, she said into her sister's shoulder. You are very clearly not okay, her sister said, but you will be. You're the most stubborn person I have ever met in my life. Yeah, Hannah said, I know. They stood there for a moment that had nothing to do with federal investigations or civil rights lawsuits or the names of people above the mayor. Just 2 sisters in the lobby of a federal building, one of whom had gotten on a plane because the other one needed her to. It lasted 30 seconds before Davenport appeared at the end of the corridor and said with genuine apology in his voice, Hannah, I need you back in the room. She pulled back. She straightened her spine. She looked at her sister. Give me an hour. Her sister looked at Davenport. She's eaten 1 sandwich in 24 hours. We're aware, Davenport said. We're working on it. Hannah followed him back down the corridor, and as she walked, she asked the question she'd been holding since he'd come to find her. Is it Crane? Did he talk? He talked, Davenport said. And Hannah, he stopped walking. He turned to face her with an expression she hadn't seen from him yet. Not the focused professional calm. Something more complicated than that. Something that said, I'm about to tell you something that's going to change the shape of this thing again. The name Crane gave us is someone you've heard of, not someone from Ridgewood Falls, someone at the state level with direct influence over the hospital's board appointment process. Hannah was very still. A state health official, Davenport continued, Someone who has been publicly advocating for healthcare reform for the past 4 years. Someone who has given speeches about hospital accountability. He held her gaze. Someone who it appears has been using those speeches as cover while simultaneously protecting this network from federal scrutiny. The irony of it, the specific nauseating irony of a person standing at a podium talking about accountability while pocketing the proceeds of stolen medical supplies settled on Hannah like something heavy and cold. "What's his name?" she said. Davenport told her. She knew the name. Everyone in healthcare in this region knew the name. She had seen him speak at a conference 2 years ago and had genuinely thought, that he was one of the ones who actually cared. "How long?" she asked. "Crane says 4 years, maybe more." Hannah turned away. She walked 3 steps. She turned back. "Then we go after him," she said. "All the way, whatever it takes." "That was already our plan," Davenport said. "Good," she said. "Then we're on the same page." And she walked back into the conference room, sat down, and picked up the next document in the stack, because Robert Crane had just made the network larger, and a larger network meant more work, and more work was exactly what Hannah Mercer intended to do. The name Davenport had given her state health director Raymond Colby sat in Hannah's chest like a stone for the rest of that afternoon. Not because she was surprised exactly. She had stopped being surprised somewhere around hour 6 of the investigation that had consumed her life. But there was a particular kind of exhaustion that came with learning, and again, that the people who stood at the podium and talked the loudest about protecting the vulnerable were frequently the ones doing the most damage from the inside. It didn't shock her. It just made her tired in a way that coffee and sandwiches couldn't touch. She was still working through the Delwood shipping manifest when Carol Vega came back into the conference room at 4 in the afternoon with a specific expression, focused and forward-leaning, that Hannah had already learned meant something significant had moved. "We're filing tomorrow morning," Vega said without sitting down. Hannah looked up. "The civil rights lawsuit. Against Officers Pruitt and Kovach individually. Against Chief Hale in his official capacity. Against the city of Ridgewood Falls. And Mayo," Vega said, and here she paused just long enough to give the next word its full weight, "against the office of the mayor, for the coordinated use of law enforcement resources to obstruct a federal investigation and retaliate against a protected witness." "That's a broad filing," Hannah said. "It is a precise filing," Vega corrected. "Every element is documented. The fabricated charges, the timing relative to your federal cooperation, the communications we've already obtained between Pruitt and someone in the mayor's office that occurred 40 minutes before your arrest." She put a single sheet of paper on the table in front of Hannah. "That's the communication. Read the last line." Hannah read it. The last line said, "Make sure it happens tonight. We need her off the board before the week is out." She set the paper down. She thought about standing in that parking lot. She thought about Pruitt not meeting her eyes. She thought about "make sure it happens tonight" and felt the cold, deliberate premeditation of it settle through her like ice water. "They ordered it," she said, "specifically, in writing." "In writing," Vega confirmed, "which means that when we walk into court tomorrow, we are not arguing intent. Intent is already documented. We are arguing consequence." She finally sat down. "Hannah, I want to be direct with you. This lawsuit is going to work. The evidence is clean, the documentation is airtight, and the federal investigation running parallel to it gives us the kind of institutional momentum that civil cases almost never get to benefit from. This is winnable, significantly winnable." She paused. "But it is also going to be hard. There are people, some of them still not yet arrested, some of them in positions that protect them temporarily, who are going to spend the next several months trying to turn public opinion against you. The social media attack this morning was the opening move. It will not be the last." Hannah nodded slowly. "I know. Are you prepared for that?" Hannah looked at the sheet of paper still on the table. "Make sure it happens tonight." She looked at it for a long moment. Then she said, "Dr. Vega, I kept a handwritten notebook for 8 months hidden inside a copy of Gray's Anatomy on my bookshelf. I bought a second-hand phone with cash to document evidence because I was afraid my personal device was being monitored. I worked double shifts in a hospital that was stealing from its own patients and smiled at the people responsible for that theft because I needed them to believe they were invisible to me." She looked up. "I have been prepared for this since before I understood what this was." Vega looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "Good. Then let's build something they can't tear down." The filing went out at 9 the following morning. By 9:15, it was the second biggest story in the state. By 10, it was national. The first story, still the first story and likely to stay there for some time, was the arrest of Raymond Colby. It had happened at 7:45 that morning. Federal agents had gone to Colby's office in the state capitol, where he had apparently been briefed by his own attorney the night before that cooperation was his best remaining option, and had been, by all accounts from the agents involved, surprisingly composed about the whole thing. He had stood up from his desk. He had put on his jacket. He had said to the agent who presented the warrant, "I'd like to call my wife before we go." They had allowed him 30 seconds. Hannah heard about it from Davenport, who called her on her cell at 8:15 while she was sitting with her sister at the kitchen table of her apartment, the first time she had been home in 36 hours eating actual food that her sister had gone to the grocery store to buy because the situation required both calories and someone who loved you making them. "Colby's in custody," Davenport said. Hannah put down her fork. How did he seem? Like a man who knew it was coming and is now calculating how to make the best of the situation he's in. He'll probably cooperate. He paused. Which means the network gets bigger before it gets smaller. How much bigger? Hannah. He said her name the way he said it when he was about to tell her something she needed to sit down for. She was already sitting down. "We've had 11 more individuals reach out through attorneys in the past 18 hours. 11 of them from 4 states. We are now looking at what may be one of the largest coordinated medical supply fraud and corruption cases in federal history. The U.S. Attorney's Office is calling it Operation Clean Slate internally. It's going to be the name of the investigation." Hannah sat with that, the sound of her sister moving around the kitchen, the morning light, the smell of actual coffee from an actual coffee maker, rather than the institutional variety she had been running on for the past day and a half. The number 11. 4 states. It started with a number that didn't add up, she said, more to herself than to him. "What? Nothing," she said. "Marcus, what do you need from me today?" "Today," he said, and there was something almost gentle in it. "I need you to rest. Tomorrow we start depositions. It's going to be a long process and I need you sharp. So today eat something, sleep, let your sister take care of you for one day. Can you do that?" She looked at the plate in front of her. She thought about the depositions, the trials, the months of legal process that were coming, the civil lawsuit running parallel, the expanding investigation, the names she still didn't know. "I can try," she said. "That's all I'm asking." She put the phone down. Her sister appeared beside her and refilled her coffee without being asked, the way people who know you deeply know exactly what you need without having to be told. "Big?" her sister asked. "Enormous," Hannah said. Her sister sat down across from her. She looked at Hannah the way only people who have known you since you were children can look at you, with a kind of seeing that goes all the way back, that doesn't require explanation or context, that simply holds you in the full complexity of who you are. "Are you okay?" she asked. Not the social version of the question. The real one. Hannah thought about it honestly. "I'm angry," she said. "I'm angry about Patricia Frost. I'm angry about Raymond Colby standing at a podium talking about hospital accountability while she stopped. "I'm angry about the patients, the ones at Ridgewood Memorial and the ones at 11 other facilities across 4 states who were affected by this and who will never know exactly what happened to them or why. I'm angry that it took someone like me deciding to risk everything to make any of this visible." She picked up her coffee cup. "But I'm not broken, and I'm not stopping." Her sister reached across the table and put her hand on Hannah's. "I know," she said. "You never do." 2 days later, the first deposition began. It lasted 6 hours. Hannah sat in a conference room with Vega on one side and a federal attorney on the other, and answered questions with the methodical, precise accuracy of someone who had been preparing for this moment without knowing exactly what form it would take for 8 months. Every question about the documentation she answered completely. Every question about the evidence chain she traced from beginning to end without gaps. Every question about the specific incidents she had witnessed or recorded, she answered with dates and times and the particular contextual details that made her account not just credible, but ironclad. The attorney on the other side of the table, representing a coalition of the defendants, tried 3 separate times to shake her. Once on the old disciplinary review, which Vega shut down with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been waiting for exactly that move. Once on the question of whether she had any personal animosity toward hospital administration, a line of questioning that Hannah handled so calmly and so thoroughly that the attorney moved on within 4 minutes. And once in what Hannah recognized as a deliberate last attempt to destabilize her on the subject of Patricia Frost. "Ms. Mercer," the attorney said in a tone calibrated to sound casual and land like something else entirely, "isn't it true that Dr. Frost was a close personal mentor of yours, and that discovering her involvement in this matter might have colored your recollection of events in a way that made you more likely to interpret ambiguous information in the most damaging possible light?" The conference room was very quiet. Hannah looked at the attorney. She had thought about this question. Not this specific question, but the territory it was trying to occupy. The idea that emotion compromised her, that betrayal distorted her judgment, that the human cost of what she had uncovered was a liability to the truth of it, rather than the reason she had been willing to pay that cost. Dr. Frost's involvement, Hannah said clearly and without rush, is not something I interpreted. It is something documented in 14 months of communications between her and the individuals charged in this case. I did not feel my way to that conclusion. I documented my way to it as I documented every other element of this investigation. If anything, the personal relationship made me more careful, not less, because I did not want to be wrong about someone I respected. I checked and rechecked every piece of evidence that touched her name. What you have in those files is the result of that care, not a failure of it. The attorney wrote something on his legal pad. He did not ask a follow-up question on that line. After the deposition in the corridor outside Vegas said to her very quietly, textbook, absolutely textbook. I just told the truth, Hannah said. You told the truth in a way that could not be used against you, Vega said. Those are not always the same thing, and the fact that in your case they were is going to matter in that courtroom. The trial preparation consumed the next 3 months in a way that Hannah had not fully anticipated, not because she wasn't prepared for the work, but because the work expanded in directions she hadn't expected. The investigation, now operating under the name Operation Clean Slate, made 8 more arrests in 2 other states before the end of its second month. The total number of individuals charged climbed from 29 to 44, and then in a third wave that generated its own national news cycle to 57. The medical supply network that Hannah's notebook had first touched the edge of turned out to have been operational for 6 years and had diverted an estimated $42 million in medical supplies and medications from hospitals across 4 states. The patient impact review that Davenport had mentioned that first morning, the review that Hannah had not allowed herself to think about too directly because thinking about it too directly made the anger almost unmanageable. That review found documented instances of care disruption at 9 facilities. 9 hospitals where patients had received delayed medications, equipment, substitutions, or rationed supplies because the supply chain feeding those hospitals had been systematically looted. The morning that report was released publicly, Hannah was in Davenport's office when his phone rang, and it was the U.S. attorney himself, which she could tell from the way Davenport straightened slightly and said, "Yes, sir," twice in the first 30 seconds. When he hung up, he turned to Hannah. "Congressional inquiry," he said. "The Senate Health Committee wants to hold hearings. They're going to subpoena records, and they're going to want witnesses." He looked at her directly. "They're going to want you." Hannah had been standing. She sat down. "Congress. You would be testifying before the Senate Health Committee about the systemic failures in hospital oversight that allowed this to operate for 6 years." He paused. "It's voluntary. We cannot compel you. But I'll do it," she said, before he'd finished the sentence. Davenport nodded once as if he'd known she would say that, which he probably had. "The hearing is scheduled for 8 weeks out. Vega will prepare you. It's a different kind of forum than the deposition, more public, more political, more subject to grandstanding from committee members who may not be interested in the truth so much as in how they look on camera. I've dealt with people who are more interested in appearances than in truth for the past 8 months, Hannah said. I know how to stay on message." The Senate hearing happened on a Tuesday in March in a chamber that felt both larger and more formal than Hannah had prepared herself for, even after Vega's extensive preparation. She sat at the witness table in a dark blazer, her hands folded in front of her, and looked at the faces of 12 senators arranged in a semicircle above her and thought with a clarity that surprised her. This is just a bigger room. The truth is the same in a bigger room. The hearing lasted 4 hours. 3 of the senators used their time productively. 2 used their time to make speeches at Hannah rather than ask questions. 1, a senator from a state Hannah had not expected to be sympathetic, asked her something that the others hadn't, something that cut through the procedural language and the legal framework and went directly to the human center of what she was there to talk about. "Ms. Mercer," he said, "in your experience, and you have more direct experience with this specific situation than anyone else in this room, what was the single most important factor that allowed this network to operate for 6 years without being detected and stopped?" Hannah thought about it. Not because she didn't know the answer, she had known the answer for a long time. She thought about it because she wanted to say it correctly. "Diffusion of responsibility," she said. "At every level of this network, there was always someone else whose job it technically was to catch what was wrong. Auditors deferred to administrators. Administrators deferred to officials. Officials deferred to oversight bodies that were underfunded and understaffed. Everyone assumed someone else was watching. And the people running the network understood that structure and exploited it systematically." She paused. "What stopped it was one person who decided it was her job even when it technically wasn't. That's not a sustainable model for accountability. The system should not depend on one nurse willing to risk everything to make it work." The chamber was quiet. The senator nodded slowly. "What would a sustainable model look like?" Independent oversight with real authority and real resources, Hannah said. Anonymous reporting channels with genuine whistleblower protection that has teeth. Regular third-party audits of supply chains that aren't contracted to firms with existing relationships with the institutions they're auditing. And, she said, and this was the part she had thought about most carefully, a culture inside medical institutions where raising concerns is rewarded and not punished. Because I was not the only person at Ridgewood Memorial who sensed something was wrong. I was just the only one who felt she could do something about it without losing everything, saying, that needs to change, that has to change. The senator wrote something down. He looked up. Thank you, Ms. Mercer. I think you have given this committee more clarity in the last 3 minutes than we've had on this issue in the last 3 years. Hannah walked out of the Senate building at 4 in the afternoon into a cold March day, and Vega and her sister were both waiting at the bottom of the steps, and her sister said, how'd it go? And Hannah said, I told the truth, and her sister said, then it went fine. And that somehow was exactly right. The trials began in April. There were multiple proceedings across multiple courts, structured to manage the volume of defendants and the geographic spread of the charges. Hannah testified in 3 of them. Each time she sat in the witness box and answered questions with the same steady documented precision that she had maintained from the first deposition to the Senate chamber. Each time the defense attempted some version of the same approach, casting doubt on her motives, her methods, her character. Each time the documentary evidence made those attempts collapse under their own weight. Mayor William Carr pled guilty in the second week of his trial when it became clear that the communications evidence and Crane's testimony had removed any viable path to acquittal. He stood in a federal courtroom and said the words guilty and guilty and guilty to 3 separate charges, and Hannah was in the gallery when he said them, and she felt nothing dramatic. No surge of triumph, no particular satisfaction. Just a kind of completion. The closing of a door that had been open for too long. Chief Hale went to trial and was convicted on all counts. Robert Crane received a reduced sentence in exchange for cooperation that had, by the final accounting, helped bring down 11 additional defendants. Raymond Colby, the state health director, who had given speeches about accountability while protecting a $42 million theft network, received the heaviest sentence of anyone in the case, 14 years, and the federal judge in her sentencing statement used the word betrayal 7 times. Patricia Frost pled guilty to a single count of conspiracy in exchange for her cooperation and testimony, which the prosecution used in 2 separate trials. Her sentence included no prison time, but stripped her of her medical license and required 3 years of supervised community service. Hannah heard the sentence read and sat with it for a long time. She didn't celebrate it. She didn't mourn it. She filed it away in the part of herself that had learned over the past months that justice in the real world was not a clean thing. It was a negotiated thing, a complicated thing, a thing that sometimes looked like what it should and sometimes looked like the best available version of what it could be. Officer Barlow, the young officer who had brought her water in the holding cell, was investigated as part of the civil rights complaint and cleared of direct involvement in the conspiracy. He remained on the force. He transferred to a different precinct. 6 months after everything, he sent Hannah a handwritten letter that said in part, "You told me to figure out what kind of officer I wanted to be. I've been working on that. I don't know if I've gotten it right yet, but I'm trying, and I think you'd want me to tell you that." Hannah kept the letter. She kept it in the same box where she kept the notebook, the handwritten one from Grey's Anatomy, the one that had started all of it. The civil rights lawsuit settled 14 months after filing. The city of Ridgewood Falls, the department, and the individual officers reached a settlement that included a formal public apology, a restructuring of the department's oversight protocols, mandatory civil rights training, and an independent review board with genuine investigative authority. The financial component of the settlement, Hannah directed entirely toward a fund established in collaboration with the Hospital Workers Union to support nurses and medical staff who came forward with workplace safety or ethical concerns, a fund designed specifically to provide the legal and professional support that Hannah had had to fight for in real time because no system had existed to give it to her. She stood in front of a room full of hospital workers at the launch event for that fund and said very simply, "I did not do this alone. I did this because I could not pretend not to see what I saw. And what I want every person in this room to understand is that you are allowed to see what you see. You are allowed to name it. And from today, if you do, someone will be there." She didn't cry saying it. She had cried twice in the entire 18 months since the parking lot arrest, once very briefly on her sister's shoulder in the lobby of the federal building, and once alone in her apartment at 3 in the morning, about 2 weeks after everything, when the adrenaline had finally burned through and the full weight of it had come down on her all at once, and she had sat on her kitchen floor and let it. Both times she had gotten back up. Getting back up was the thing. That was the thing she had learned, not in the parking lot, not in the holding cell, not in the Senate chamber, or the courtroom, or the deposition room. She had learned it long before any of this in the Army, in places that had asked more of her than she'd known she had to give. Getting back up was not an exceptional quality. It was just a decision made over and over in the specific circumstances that made it hardest. She went back to nursing. Not at Ridgewood Memorial, that would have been too much, too soon, a building that held too many layers of what she now knew. She took a position at a hospital 30 miles away, in a unit she chose specifically because it was understaffed and under-resourced and needed someone willing to stay late and notice things. She negotiated her schedule around the remaining trial appearances. She answered Davenport's calls when Operation Clean Slate surfaced new threads, which it did 3 more times in the first year, each time adding names to a list that had started at 29 and had become something much larger and more consequential than anyone standing in a hospital parking lot on a cold night had known they were setting in motion. Davenport called her on the anniversary of the arrest, not for case business, just a call. "How are you doing?" he asked. "I'm working a double," she said. "Room 7 has a patient who's been waiting 6 hours for a pain management consult. I'm trying to expedite it." Davenport was quiet for a moment. Then he laughed, a real one, the kind she hadn't heard from him before. "Of course you are." "Was there something specific?" she asked, because she had 4 rooms to check before her next break. "No," he said. "I just wanted you to know that the case, what you built, what you did, it's being used now. Training materials, federal guidelines. 3 other states have opened investigations modeled on the methodology your documentation established." He paused. "You didn't just take down 57 people, Hannah. You changed how this is done." She stood in the corridor outside room 7 and held the phone and let that land. Let it be real and specific and genuinely felt, for the length of time it took to fully receive it. Then she said, "I have to get back to my patient." "I know," Davenport said. "Take care of yourself." "Always," she said. And she meant it. She went back to room 7. She knocked. She went in. She sat down next to a 68-year-old man who had been waiting in discomfort for 6 hours and whose chart told her more than enough about what he needed, and she said, "I'm Hannah. I'm your nurse. Let's figure out what's going on with you." He looked at her with the particular relief of someone who has been waiting to be seen by someone who was actually going to pay attention, and he said, "Nobody's had time for me all day." "I have time," Hannah said. "Tell me everything." She had started with a number that didn't add up. She had ended with 57 arrests, a Senate hearing, a fund that would protect the people who came after her, and federal guidelines that would outlast every single person in every courtroom that had processed the wreckage of what she'd found. She had been handcuffed in a parking lot by people who thought that stopping her was as simple as stopping her, and she had let them put those handcuffs on because she understood even in that moment that the truth she was carrying was larger than what any pair of handcuffs could contain. Hannah Mercer had started this because she could not pretend not to see what she saw, and she had finished it, if it could ever be called finish, the same way she had started, with her hands on the work, her eyes open, and her complete and unwavering refusal to look away.